The air inside the Scottish Community Centre in Blackburn, West Lothian, was thick with anticipation on a cold November evening in 2008. Inside the modest building, a woman named Susan Boyle stood nervously among dozens of other hopefuls, all waiting for their chance to audition for Britain's Got Talent. She clutched a small piece of paper with her song choice written on it, her hands trembling slightly as she watched other performers come and go through the audition room doors. Susan was 47 years old, unmarried, and had spent most of her life caring for her elderly mother in the small village where she had grown up. She had never traveled far from home, never pursued a professional singing career, and had spent decades singing only in her local church choir and occasionally at karaoke nights in nearby pubs. Susan had always loved to sing. From the time she was a young girl, music had been her constant companion, her source of joy, and her way of expressing emotions that she sometimes struggled to put into words. Her mother had encouraged her musical interests, always telling her that she had a special gift, but life had other plans. Susan had been born with learning difficulties due to complications during birth, and growing up in a small Scottish town in the 1960s and 70s meant facing cruelty and mockery from other children who didn't understand her. She was teased relentlessly at school, called names, and made to feel different and less than her peers. These early experiences left deep scars, making her shy and reluctant to put herself forward in any situation where she might face judgment or ridicule. Despite the challenges, Susan's love for singing never dimmed. She would listen to her favorite singers on the radio, imagining herself on stage, performing for audiences who would appreciate her voice. Her mother remained her biggest supporter, always believing that someday the world would hear Susan sing and recognize her talent. They would watch singing competitions on television together, and her mother would say that Susan could do just as well as any of the performers they saw on screen. But Susan never had the confidence to try, never believed that someone like her, from a tiny village with no formal training and no conventional beauty, could ever make it in the competitive world of professional music. Everything changed when Susan's mother passed away in 2007. The loss devastated her completely. Her mother had been her best friend, her protector, her constant source of encouragement and love. Suddenly, Susan found herself alone in the family home, grieving deeply and wondering what purpose her life had now. She had devoted so many years to caring for her mother that she had never built a life of her own, never pursued her dreams, never taken risks. In the darkest days of her grief, Susan made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. She decided to audition for Britain's Got Talent, not because she believed she would win, but because she wanted to honor her mother's memory and finally pursue the dream they had talked about for so many years. The audition process for Britain's Got Talent was intimidating from the very start. Susan had to fill out extensive application forms, explaining who she was and why she wanted to be on the show. She had to record preliminary auditions and go through several rounds of screening before she was even invited to audition in front of the judges. Each step of the process tested her resolve, and there were many moments when she nearly gave up, convinced that she was foolish to think she had any chance of success. But something kept pushing her forward, perhaps the memory of her mother's voice telling her she was special, or perhaps a deep buried part of herself that still believed in the power of her own voice. When Susan finally received the invitation to audition in front of the judges in Glasgow, she was terrified and excited in equal measure. She took the bus from Blackburn to the city, a journey of less than 30 miles that felt like traveling to another world. Glasgow's Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre, where the auditions were being held, was enormous and intimidating. Thousands of hopeful performers had gathered, each one believing they had something special to offer, each one dreaming of fame and success. Susan looked around at the other contestants and felt her confidence shrinking. Many of them were young, beautiful, and polished, with professional headshots and elaborate costumes. They moved with a confidence that Susan had never possessed, chatting easily with each other about their training, their previous performances, their connections in the entertainment industry. Susan, by contrast, looked exactly like what she was, an ordinary middle-aged woman from a small village. She wore a simple dress that she had chosen carefully from her modest wardrobe, hoping it would be appropriate for the stage. Her hair was styled in a way that she thought looked nice, though it was far from the sleek professional styling of many other female contestants. She carried herself with the slight awkwardness of someone who was not used to being in the spotlight, who had spent most of her life trying to blend into the background rather than stand out. As she waited for her turn to audition, she could hear the muffled sounds of performances from inside the audition hall, the judges' comments, the audience's reactions. Sometimes there was applause and cheering, other times groans or uncomfortable silence. Each reaction made Susan's nervousness increase. The waiting area was filled with nervous energy, Some contestants paced back and forth, practicing their routines or warming up their voices. Others sat quietly, lost in their own thoughts and fears. Susan tried to keep to herself, not wanting to draw attention or engage in conversation that might increase her anxiety. She had chosen to sing "I Dreamed a Dream" from the musical Les Miserables, a song that had always moved her deeply with its themes of lost hope and faded dreams. The character who sings it in the musical, Fantine, is a woman whose life has been filled with disappointment and hardship, who remembers a time when she believed in a better future. Susan felt a deep connection to those lyrics, seeing in them a reflection of her own life, her own struggles, her own sense of dreams deferred and opportunities missed. As the hours passed and more contestants went through, Susan's turn drew closer. A production assistant finally called her name, and she stood up on shaky legs, following the assistant toward the stage entrance. Behind the curtain, she could hear the audience chattering, the judges talking amongst themselves, the general buzz of activity that surrounds a major television production. The assistant gave her some final instructions about where to stand, where to look, how the process would work. Susan nodded, trying to absorb the information while her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone around her must be able to hear it. She had watched Britain's Got Talent on television before and knew what to expect. She would walk out onto the stage, introduce herself to the judges Simon Cowell, Amanda Holden, and Piers Morgan, tell them a bit about herself, and then perform her song. The judges would give their comments, vote yes or no, and she would either move forward in the competition or go home. The stage manager counted down, signaling that it was time for her to go on. Susan took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to her mother, and stepped through the curtain onto the stage. The lights were blindingly bright, much more intense than she had imagined. The audience stretched out before her, hundreds of faces looking at her with curiosity and anticipation. At the judges' table, Simon Cowell sat with his characteristic expression of skeptical boredom. Amanda Holden looked friendly but non-committal, and Piers Morgan appeared ready to be entertained or unimpressed depending on what happened next. The show's hosts, Ant and Dec, stood off to the side, ready to facilitate the audition and provide commentary. Susan walked to the center of the stage, and immediately she could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The audience's chatter didn't quite die down the way it had for some previous contestants. There were a few scattered giggles, some whispers, curious glances exchanged between audience members. Susan was acutely aware that she didn't look like the typical reality show contestant. She didn't have the youth, the glamour, or the polished presentation that television audiences had come to expect. She looked like someone's aunt, someone's neighbor, an ordinary woman who might be more at home at a church social than on a glittering television stage. But she had come too far to turn back now. She had made a promise to herself and to her mother's memory, and she was determined to see it through. Simon Cowell looked up from his notes and asked her name. Susan told him, her voice carrying the thick Scottish accent of her home region. He asked how old she was, and when she replied that she was 47, there were more titters from the audience. Simon raised his eyebrows slightly, and Susan could see the familiar expression of skepticism that he was famous for. He asked what she did for a living, and Susan explained that she was currently unemployed, that she had never been married, and that she lived alone with her cat, Pebbles. The audience's reaction was not entirely kind. There were more laughs, more whispers, more of that uncomfortable energy that comes when people are judging someone based purely on appearances and superficial details. Amanda Holden asked Susan what her dream was, why she had come to audition for Britain's Got Talent. This was the moment Susan had been preparing for, the moment to explain herself and her purpose. She spoke about wanting to be a professional singer, about how she had always dreamed of performing on a big stage in front of an appreciative audience. She mentioned that she wanted to be like Elaine Paige, the legendary British singer and actress known for her incredible performances in musical theater. When Susan said this, there was an audible reaction from the audience, a mixture of surprised laughter and skeptical murmurs. The idea that this ordinary-looking woman from a small Scottish village could aspire to be like one of Britain's most celebrated performers seemed almost absurd to many watching. Simon Cowell, never one to hide his thoughts, gave Susan a look that clearly communicated his doubts. Piers Morgan smirked slightly, and even Amanda Holden, who was generally the kindest of the three judges, couldn't quite hide her skepticism. The audience's energy was equally doubtful. Susan could feel their judgment, could sense that many of them had already decided she was going to be a joke, another delusional contestant who had no idea of her own limitations. It was exactly the kind of situation Susan had feared her entire life, the kind of moment that had kept her from pursuing her dreams for decades. She was standing in front of thousands of people, in front of television cameras that would broadcast this moment to millions more, and she was being laughed at before she had even sung a single note. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The music began, and for a brief moment, Susan closed her eyes and let the familiar melody wash over her. The opening notes of I Dreamed a Dream filled the auditorium, and she prepared herself to sing the first line. In that instant before her voice emerged, Susan was transported back to all the times she had sung this song alone in her living room, imagining this very moment. She thought of her mother sitting in her favorite chair, encouraging her, telling her that her voice was beautiful and that the world needed to hear it. She thought of all the years of longing, all the dreams deferred, all the moments when she had wanted to share her gift but had been too afraid of rejection and ridicule. Then Susan opened her mouth and began to sing. The first notes that came out were powerful, clear, and absolutely stunning. The effect on the audience was instantaneous and dramatic. The laughter stopped abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. The skeptical smirks disappeared from faces throughout the auditorium. People who had been whispering to their neighbors fell silent, their attention suddenly riveted on the woman standing center stage. The judges, who had been sitting back in their chairs with expressions ranging from bored to patronizing, immediately sat up straighter, their faces registering shock and disbelief. Susan sang the opening lines about remembering a time when life was beautiful and dreams were worth making. Her voice carried a depth of emotion that could only come from someone who had truly lived those words, who understood what it meant to have dreams and to watch them fade. The vocal quality was exceptional, a rich, powerful voice that filled every corner of the large auditorium with seemingly effortless projection. This was not the voice of an amateur or a delusional dreamer. This was the voice of someone with genuine, extraordinary talent. Amanda Holden's hands flew to her face, covering her mouth in astonishment. Her eyes widened and began to glisten with tears as she listened to Susan's performance. Piers Morgan leaned forward in his chair, his expression transformed from amused skepticism to genuine amazement. Even Simon Cowell, famous for his harsh critiques and impossible standards, showed visible surprise. His eyebrows raised, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. In the audience, people began standing up, not waiting for the performance to end but rising to their feet as they listened, unable to contain their excitement and appreciation. As Susan continued singing, moving through the verses about life killing the dreams she dreamed, her voice grew even more powerful and emotionally resonant. She wasn't just singing the notes correctly, though her technical skill was impressive. She was inhabiting the song, pouring every ounce of her life experience into the performance. Every disappointment she had faced, every moment of being underestimated and dismissed, every year of caring for her mother while her own dreams seemed to slip further away, all of it came through in her voice. The audience could hear not just talent but truth, not just skill but soul. The transformation in the auditorium was complete. What had begun as a moment of mockery and judgment had become something entirely different. People who had laughed at Susan moments before were now cheering, clapping along, some even crying as they listened. The camera operators, who had likely expected to capture another awkward audition for comedic effect, now focused intently on Susan's face, capturing every moment of her triumphant performance. The lighting crew adjusted their spots to showcase her properly, treating her like the star she was proving herself to be. Susan reached the emotional climax of the song, the part where Fantine sings about dreams being made and used and wasted. Her voice soared on the high notes, demonstrating a range and power that would have been impressive from any professional singer, let alone someone who had never had formal training or professional experience. The audience was going wild now, many people on their feet, applauding even while she was still singing. Amanda Holden was openly crying, tears streaming down her face as she watched this remarkable woman command the stage with such unexpected brilliance. When Susan sang the final notes and the music came to an end, there was a moment of silence, that brief pause that sometimes occurs when an audience is so moved that they need a second to process what they have just witnessed. Then the auditorium erupted. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming, the kind of ovation usually reserved for established stars, not unknown contestants at early auditions. People were cheering, whistling, screaming their approval. Many in the audience were crying, moved not just by the beautiful voice, but by the story unfolding before them. The story of someone who had been dismissed and underestimated, proving everyone wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Susan stood on the stage, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the reaction. She had hoped to do well, had believed in her voice even when others didn't, but this level of response was beyond anything she had imagined. The judges were all standing now, joining the audience in their ovation. Amanda Holden was applauding enthusiastically while wiping tears from her eyes. Piers Morgan was clapping and shaking his head in disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just witnessed. Simon Cowell was smiling broadly, a rare and genuine expression of pleasure and surprise. The hosts, Ant and Dec, were also visibly moved by what had just happened. They had witnessed countless auditions over the years, some good, some bad, some truly awful. But this was something special, something that transcended the usual reality show drama. This was a genuine moment of discovery, the finding of a truly exceptional talent in the most unlikely package. They could sense that they had just witnessed something that would become a defining moment not just for this season of the show, but for the program's entire history. Simon Cowell raised his hand to quiet the audience so the judges could give their comments. It took several minutes for the applause and cheering to die down enough for him to speak. When he finally could be heard, his first words acknowledged what everyone in the room was thinking. He said that when Susan had walked out onto the stage, everyone had been laughing and making assumptions about what was going to happen. He admitted that he himself had not expected what followed. His tone was respectful, even admiring, a stark contrast to the skeptical attitude he had displayed just minutes earlier. Piers Morgan spoke next, and he was equally effusive in his praise. He said that Susan's performance was extraordinary, that her voice was absolutely stunning, and that he had been completely wrong in his initial assessment of her. He apologized for the way the audience had reacted when she first came out, acknowledging that everyone had judged her based on her appearance rather than giving her a fair chance. He told Susan that she had just delivered one of the most surprising and impressive auditions he had ever seen on the show. Amanda Holden could barely speak through her tears. She told Susan that her performance had been incredible, that her voice was absolutely beautiful, and that she had goosebumps listening to her sing. She said that Susan had proved that it doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from, that talent and authenticity can shine through and move people in profound ways. She thanked Susan for having the courage to come and audition, for sharing her gift with them and with the world. The voting was a formality at this point. All three judges enthusiastically voted yes, sending Susan through to the next round of the competition. The audience erupted again in applause and cheering. Susan's face showed a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. She thanked the judges, her voice shaking with emotion, and then walked off the stage to even more applause. Backstage, she was immediately surrounded by production staff, other contestants, and crew members, all wanting to congratulate her and tell her how amazing she had been. The video of Susan's audition was posted online shortly after the episode aired on British television in April 2009. Within hours, it began going viral in a way that few videos had before. This was still relatively early in the era of viral internet content, but Susan's audition struck a chord with people all over the world. Within days, the video had been viewed millions of times. Within weeks, it had become one of the most watched videos in internet history, viewed by hundreds of millions of people across every continent. The global response to Susan Boyle's audition was unprecedented and revealed something profound about human nature and the universal appeal of her story. People from every country, every culture, every walk of life found themselves moved by the footage of this ordinary-looking Scottish woman, proving everyone wrong with her extraordinary voice. The video was shared on social media platforms, emailed between friends and family members, discussed on news programs, and analyzed by cultural commentators trying to understand why this particular moment had resonated so powerfully with so many people. Part of the appeal was certainly the surprise factor, the dramatic contrast between expectations and reality. Viewers watching the video experienced the same journey as the live audience had, starting with skepticism or even mockery, then experiencing shock and amazement as Susan's voice emerged. This emotional arc made for compelling viewing, a perfectly structured narrative that could have been written by a Hollywood screenwriter if it hadn't been completely spontaneous and genuine. The video captured a universal fantasy, the idea that someone ordinary and overlooked might actually possess extraordinary gifts that the world has simply failed to recognize. But the response went deeper than just entertainment or surprise. Susan's story touched on fundamental human experiences and desires. Her journey spoke to anyone who had ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or judged based on superficial characteristics rather than their true worth. It resonated with people who had dreams they felt were impossible, who had been told they weren't good enough, pretty enough, young enough, or talented enough to achieve what they hoped for. Susan represented the possibility that it's never too late, that dreams deferred are not necessarily dreams denied, that authenticity and genuine talent can eventually triumph over shallow judgments and conventional expectations. The media coverage of Susan's audition was intense and immediate. Every major news organization in Britain covered the story, with many running it as their lead item despite competition from traditional hard news stories about politics and economics. The tabloids, always hungry for human interest stories, went into overdrive. Reporters descended on Blackburn, West Lothian, trying to learn everything they could about Susan's background, her life, her personality. They interviewed her neighbors, people who had known her for years, members of her church choir. They photographed her modest home, the streets of her small village, the places where she had lived her quiet, unremarkable life. International media picked up the story with equal enthusiasm. American news programs featured Susan's audition prominently, with anchors and commentators expressing amazement at her talent and her story. The video was shown on morning shows, evening news broadcasts, and entertainment programs. Susan was interviewed via satellite by major American television networks, speaking from studios in Scotland to hosts and audiences thousands of miles away. Asian, European, South American, and Australian media all covered the phenomenon, making Susan Boyle a truly global sensation almost overnight. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent her entire life in relative obscurity and isolation. Susan had never traveled extensively, had rarely been far from her small village, and had certainly never experienced anything like international fame. Suddenly, reporters were camped outside her home, following her when she went to the shops trying to get interviews and photographs. Her phone rang constantly with requests for appearances, interviews, and performances. Television producers wanted her for their shows, magazines wanted her for their covers, and recording companies began circling, hoping to sign her to a contract. Susan handled the sudden fame with a mixture of graciousness and bewilderment. In interviews, she remained humble and genuine, never pretending to be anything other than what she was, an ordinary woman who happened to have an extraordinary voice. She spoke candidly about her life, her struggles, her mother, and her dreams. She didn't try to manufacture a more glamorous or interesting backstory, didn't attempt to reshape her image into something more conventionally appealing. This authenticity only endeared her further to the public, who appreciated her honesty and lack of pretension. However, the intensity of the attention also began to take its toll. Susan was not accustomed to being in the public eye, and the constant scrutiny was stressful and exhausting. The tabloid coverage in particular could be intrusive and unkind. While many stories celebrated her talent and her triumph, others focused on her appearance, her mannerisms, her home, her past, sometimes in ways that felt cruel and judgmental. Photographers with long lenses tried to catch unflattering pictures. Reporters dug into every aspect of her past, sometimes distorting or sensationalizing details to create more dramatic stories. The competition itself continued, and Susan had to prepare for the next rounds of Britain's Got Talent while dealing with this overwhelming media circus. She advanced through the semi-finals with another strong performance, again receiving enthusiastic support from the judges and the audience. Her rendition of Memory from the musical Cats showcased her versatility and reinforced that her initial audition had not been a fluke. She genuinely possessed a remarkable voice and the ability to connect emotionally with audiences through her performances. Throughout this period, Susan received support from the show's producers and from some of the judges, particularly Amanda Holden, who had been moved to tears by her initial audition. They tried to help her navigate the overwhelming attention and the pressures of the competition. But even with support, the experience was challenging for someone with Susan's background and temperament. She had lived a quiet, predictable life for 47 years, and now everything had changed almost overnight. She was trying to adapt to fame, media attention, performance pressure, and public scrutiny all at once. The public's investment in Susan's journey grew stronger as the competition progressed. People around the world were not just watching a talent show, they were following a story that had captured their imaginations and their hearts. Susan represented something important to millions of viewers, a symbol of hope and possibility, proof that talent and authenticity could overcome prejudice and low expectations. Her success or failure in the competition felt meaningful in a way that transcended mere entertainment. As Britain's Got Talent moved toward its finale, the pressure on Susan intensified exponentially. The final was scheduled to be broadcast live, which added an additional layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. Throughout the semifinals, Susan's performances had been pre-recorded, giving her some buffer from the immediate pressure of live performance. Now she would be singing in front of a massive live audience, with millions more watching on television in real time, knowing that any mistake or imperfection would be broadcast immediately with no opportunity for editing or retakes. The British public had embraced Susan wholeheartedly, and she entered the final as one of the favorites to win the entire competition. Bookmakers had her as the frontrunner, and informal polls suggested that she had massive public support. However, she faced strong competition from other talented acts. including a young dance group called Diversity that had impressed judges and audiences with their innovative and technically brilliant performances. The final would feature performances from all the top acts, followed by a public vote to determine the winner. In the days leading up to the final, Susan's stress levels reached a critical point. The relentless media attention, the pressure of competition, the weight of public expectation, and the emotional intensity of the entire experience had pushed her to her limits. She was exhausted physically and emotionally, struggling to sleep, dealing with anxiety, and finding it difficult to cope with the magnitude of what was happening to her. For someone who had lived such a quiet, sheltered life, the sudden transformation into a global phenomenon was almost too much to bear. The production team and the show's organizers became concerned about Susan's well-being. They could see that she was struggling, that the pressure was affecting her mental and emotional state. There were discussions about providing her with additional support, perhaps professional counseling or coaching to help her manage the stress. Some people close to the situation worried that Susan might withdraw from the competition entirely, overwhelmed by circumstances that would have been challenging for anyone, let alone someone with her particular background and vulnerabilities. Susan's performance in the final was not her strongest. She sang "I Dreamed a Dream" again, returning to the song that had launched her into international fame. Her voice was still beautiful, still powerful, but there was a noticeable tension in her performance that hadn't been present in her initial audition. The freedom and joy that had characterized that first stunning performance was partially obscured by visible nervousness and strain. She hit all the notes, delivered the emotion, and received enthusiastic applause, but those watching carefully could see that the experience was taking a toll on her. When the results were announced later that evening, Susan Boyle did not win Britain's Got Talent. The dance group Diversity took the title, having delivered an exceptional final performance that showcased their creativity, technical skill, and group cohesion. Susan came in second place, a result that disappointed many of her supporters, but that also in some ways may have been a relief to Susan herself. The pressure of winning, of having to fulfill all the obligations and expectations that would come with the title, might have been even more overwhelming than what she was already experiencing. Susan's reaction to coming in second was gracious and dignified. She congratulated the winners, acknowledged that they had been brilliant, and thanked everyone who had supported her throughout the competition. In interviews immediately following the final, she spoke about how grateful she was for the opportunity, how much the experience had meant to her, and how she hoped this was just the beginning of her musical career rather than the end. Her humility and genuine nature remained intact despite everything that had happened. However, in the days following the final, the strain of the previous weeks caught up with Susan in a serious way. She experienced what was described in media reports as an emotional breakdown, requiring her to briefly check into a private clinic for rest and treatment. The intense pressure, the lack of privacy, the constant scrutiny, and the emotional roller coaster of the entire experience had overwhelmed her psychological resources. For someone who had spent most of her life in relative isolation, dealing with specific challenges including the learning difficulties she had been born with, the sudden immersion in fame and public attention had been traumatic. The news of Susan's hospitalization generated a new wave of media coverage, much of it more sympathetic and reflective than previous reporting had been. Commentators and columnists began questioning whether the media and the public had failed Susan in some fundamental way, whether the very people who claimed to celebrate her had actually contributed to her distress through their insatiable appetite for stories and information about her. There were discussions about the ethics of reality television, about the responsibilities producers have toward vulnerable contestants, about the darker side of instant fame and public scrutiny. Susan spent several days recovering in the clinic, away from cameras and reporters, getting the rest and professional support she needed. Her friends and what remained of her family expressed concern about her well-being and frustration with how she had been treated by elements of the media. Mental health advocates used Susan's situation as an example of why fame and public attention can be damaging, particularly for people who may not have the resources or support systems to cope with sudden celebrity. Susan's recovery period marked a crucial turning point in her story, transforming it from a simple tale of talent discovered into a more complex narrative about fame, vulnerability, and resilience. During her time away from the public eye, important decisions were being made about her future. Despite coming in second place rather than winning Britain's Got Talent, Susan had already attracted serious interest from the music industry. Recording companies recognized that her global popularity and the emotional connection audiences felt with her represented a unique commercial opportunity. Simon Cowell's record label, Sicko Music, moved quickly to sign Susan to a recording contract. Cowell had been impressed not just by Susan's voice, but by the phenomenon she had become. He understood that Susan represented something rare in the music industry, an artist with genuine talent whose story had resonated with millions of people worldwide. Unlike many reality show contestants whose fame proves fleeting, Susan had the potential for a sustained career because her appeal was based on authentic talent and a compelling personal narrative rather than just novelty or temporary buzz. The recording contract provided Susan with professional management, financial resources, and most importantly, a team of people whose job was to protect her interests and help her navigate the music industry. This support structure would prove essential for someone who had spent decades living a simple life in a small Scottish village and was now facing opportunities and challenges that would have been difficult for anyone to manage. The team working with Susan understood that they needed to balance commercial opportunities with Susan's well-being, ensuring that she wasn't overwhelmed again by demands and expectations. Work began on Susan's debut album almost immediately. The plan was to create a record that showcased her voice while remaining true to her musical preferences and personality. Susan had always loved show tunes, classic ballads, and traditional songs, so the album would feature material in that vein rather than trying to transform her into something she wasn't. This decision reflected a wise understanding that Susan's appeal lay in her authenticity, and any attempt to drastically remake her image or sound would likely backfire with the audience that had embraced her. The recording process was intensive, but carefully managed to avoid repeating the overwhelming pressure Susan had experienced during the Britain's Got Talent competition. She worked with experienced producers and vocal coaches who helped her refine her performances while respecting her natural talent and style. The sessions took place in professional recording studios, a new environment for Susan, who had never made a professional recording before. She had to learn the technical aspects of studio work, understanding things like multiple takes, overdubbing, and how to work with headphones and microphones in ways very different from live performance. Susan's album, titled I Dreamed a Dream, after the song that had made her famous, was released in November 2009, just 7 months after her initial audition had aired on television. The timing was deliberate, capitalizing on the sustained interest in Susan while her story was still fresh in people's minds. The album featured a mix of songs including I Dreamed a Dream, Cry Me a River, How Great Thou Art, and other material that suited her voice and style. The production quality was excellent, professional arrangements that supported and showcased Susan's vocal talents without overwhelming them. The commercial response to the album exceeded even the optimistic projections of the music industry professionals involved in its creation. I Dreamed a Dream became the fastest-selling debut album in UK history, selling more copies in its first week than any debut album had sold before. The success wasn't limited to Britain. The album topped charts around the world, reaching #1 in numerous countries including the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and across Europe. In America particularly, Susan's album achieved remarkable success, eventually selling millions of copies and becoming one of the best-selling albums of the year. The success of I Dreamed a Dream represented a significant achievement in an era when the music industry was already facing challenges from digital downloads, streaming services, and changing consumer habits. Physical album sales had been declining for years, yet Susan's debut bucked that trend dramatically. People wanted to own her music, to have a tangible connection to her story and her voice. The album also performed well digitally, with downloads and streams adding to the overall commercial success. Critics' responses to the album were generally positive, though more measured than the public's enthusiastic embrace. Music reviewers acknowledged Susan's vocal talent while noting that the material was somewhat safe and traditional, aimed at a mainstream audience rather than pushing artistic boundaries. However, most critics recognized that the album achieved exactly what it set out to do, providing a showcase for Susan's voice while delivering material that would appeal to the broad audience that had fallen in love with her story. The album received several award nominations and won various honors, further validating Susan's place in the music industry. The success brought financial security to Susan for the first time in her life. She had spent years caring for her mother with limited income, living modestly in her family home in Blackburn. Now she had resources that would allow her to live comfortably, make improvements to her home, and not worry constantly about money. However, Susan's lifestyle didn't change dramatically. She remained in the same house in the same village, continuing to live relatively simply despite her newfound wealth. This consistency with her previous life was partly about comfort and familiarity, but it also reflected Susan's fundamental nature and values. With the success of her debut album established, Susan faced decisions about how to move forward with her career. The music industry presented numerous opportunities for her to capitalize on her fame through tour, television appearances, additional recordings, and various commercial ventures. However, Susan and her team had to carefully balance these opportunities against her limitations and vulnerabilities. The breakdown she had experienced following the Britain's Got Talent final served as a serious warning about the dangers of pushing too hard, of allowing commercial considerations to override concerns about her well-being. Susan did embark on promotional tour to support her album, traveling to various countries to appear on television shows, give interviews, and meet fans. These appearances were carefully scheduled and managed to avoid overwhelming her. She appeared on major American television programs including The Today Show, Good Morning America, and others, introducing herself to audiences who might have seen the viral video of her audition but didn't know much else about her. She also performed for various special events and charity functions, using her platform to support causes she cared about. One particularly significant performance came when Susan was invited to sing for Pope Benedict XVI during his visit to the United Kingdom in 2010. This was a tremendous honor for Susan, who was a devout Catholic and for whom faith had always been an important part of her life. Performing for the Pope at an open-air mass in Bellahouston Park in Glasgow represented both a personal milestone and a recognition of how far she had come from her days singing in the church choir in Blackburn. The performance was watched by thousands in person and many more on television, adding another memorable moment to Susan's growing list of achievements. Susan also performed for Queen Elizabeth II, singing at various royal events and occasions. These performances represented a kind of validation and acceptance that would have seemed impossible just a couple of years earlier. The woman who had been laughed at when she walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage was now performing for royalty, world leaders, and at prestigious venues around the globe. Yet Susan handled these honors with the same humility and authenticity that had characterized her initial audition, never allowing success to change her fundamental nature. A second album followed in 2010, titled The Gift, which focused on Christmas music and sacred songs. This album also achieved commercial success, though not quite matching the extraordinary sales figures of her debut. The pattern was similar for subsequent albums that Susan released over the following years. Each new release sold well and found an appreciative audience, though with gradually diminishing commercial impact as the initial novelty of her story faded and the music market became even more fragmented and challenging. Nevertheless, Susan had established herself as a legitimate recording artist with a dedicated fan base, rather than just a one-hit wonder or temporary phenomenon. Susan did eventually undertake some concert tour, performing for live audiences in venues around the world. These tours were significantly different from typical concert tour by major artists. The schedules were less demanding, with fewer consecutive performances and more rest time built in. The venues were often smaller and more intimate than those used by mainstream pop stars, reflecting both Susan's comfort level and her particular appeal to audiences. Her concerts focused on her singing rather than elaborate production elements, staging, or choreography. People came to hear Susan's voice and to experience the emotional connection her performances created, not for spectacle or visual entertainment. The touring experience had its challenges for Susan. Travel was difficult for someone who had rarely left her small corner of Scotland before her Britain's Got Talent audition. Being away from home, staying in hotels, dealing with different time zones, and maintaining the energy and vocal health necessary for repeated performances all proved demanding. There were occasions when Susan had to cancel performances due to exhaustion or illness, disappointing fans but recognizing her own limitations and the importance of taking care of herself. Through all of this, Susan worked to maintain some semblance of normal life in Blackburn. She still attended her local Catholic church when she was home, still valued her privacy and her routines, still tried to preserve elements of the life she had known before fame arrived. This proved increasingly difficult as tourists and fans would sometimes seek her out in the village, hoping for photographs or autographs. The quiet anonymity she had known for most of her life was gone forever, replaced by a celebrity that brought both opportunities and intrusions. Susan also had to navigate changed relationships with people in her community. Some neighbors and acquaintances were genuinely happy for her success and treated her much as they always had. Others became different around her, either overly deferential or resentful of her fame and success. There were people who claimed closer relationships with Susan than had actually existed, hoping to benefit from association with her celebrity. These social complications added another layer of difficulty to Susan's adjustment to her new life. The media's interest in Susan continued, though it evolved over time. While the initial coverage had focused on her surprising talent and her Britain's Got Talent journey, later stories often focused on her appearance, particularly any changes to her look. When Susan updated her wardrobe, changed her hairstyle, or made other modifications to her appearance, these became news stories, often with judgmental or critical undertones. This ongoing scrutiny of her looks was painful for Susan, who had faced criticism about her appearance throughout her life, and had hoped that her talent would allow people to see past superficial judgments. As years passed since her initial audition, Susan's story began to be understood in broader cultural and social contexts. Scholars, commentators, and media analysts examined the phenomenon of her sudden fame and what it revealed about contemporary society, media culture, and human nature. Her story became a case study in various fields, from psychology to media studies to discussions about ageism, appearance-based discrimination, and the nature of talent and fame in the modern world. Academic researchers analyzed the viral spread of Susan's audition video, trying to understand the mechanisms by which certain content captures global attention in the internet age. Her story represented one of the early examples of how social media and video sharing platforms could create international celebrities almost overnight, completely bypassing traditional gatekeepers and promotional channels in the entertainment industry. Before Susan Boyle, record labels, publicists, and media companies largely controlled who became famous and how their careers developed. Susan's audition showed that in the internet age, a single compelling moment captured on video could reach more people more quickly than any traditional marketing campaign. Psychologists and sociologists explored why Susan's story resonated so powerfully with so many people. They identified several key elements that made her narrative particularly compelling. First, the dramatic reversal of expectations, the contrast between the initial judgment and dismissal she faced and the extraordinary talent she revealed. This reversal satisfied something deep in human psychology, a desire to see underdogs triumph and preconceptions proven wrong. Second, Susan's authenticity and vulnerability made her relatable in ways that polished, conventionally attractive celebrities often are not. People saw in her someone like themselves or their family members, an ordinary person with an extraordinary gift. The story also touched on themes of redemption and second chances. Susan was 47 when she auditioned, an age when many people feel their opportunities have passed, when dreams not pursued seem permanently out of reach. Her success suggested that it's never too late, that talent and determination can overcome the limitations of age and circumstance. This message was particularly powerful for middle-aged and older audience members who saw in Susan's story hope for their own deferred dreams and ambitions. Gender studies scholars noted that Susan's experience highlighted persistent double standards about appearance and age in how society evaluates women versus men. A middle-aged man with an extraordinary voice but conventional appearance would likely not have faced the same level of initial mockery or later scrutiny about his looks that Susan endured. Her story revealed how quickly people judge women based on appearance, and how much harder women have to work to be recognized for their talents and abilities rather than their physical attractiveness or youth. The disability rights community also embraced Susan's story, noting that she had been open about her learning difficulties and the challenges she faced growing up. Susan became an advocate, speaking about her experiences and encouraging greater understanding and acceptance of people with disabilities. She used her platform to challenge stereotypes and to demonstrate that people with learning difficulties can achieve remarkable things when given opportunities and support. Her willingness to discuss her challenges openly helped reduce stigma and provided inspiration for others facing similar obstacles. As Susan moved through her 50s, she continued to record albums and perform, though with decreasing frequency and commercial impact. The music industry is notoriously difficult for maintaining long-term careers, and the initial excitement around any artist, no matter how compelling their story, inevitably fades as public attention moves to newer phenomena. Susan released albums in 2011, 2013, 2014, 2016, and 2019, each finding an audience among her loyal fans but no longer generating the massive sales or media attention of her first releases. Susan also explored other opportunities beyond recording. She appeared in films and television programs, usually playing herself or making cameo appearances that capitalized on her fame. She wrote an autobiography titled The Woman I Was Born to Be, published in 2010, which provided her own perspective on her journey and allowed her to share details of her life and experiences in her own words. The book was commercially successful and received generally positive reviews for its honest and unpretentious tone. Financial management became an important consideration as Susan's career matured. She She had earned substantial money from album sales, performances, and various commercial opportunities, but she needed to ensure this wealth was properly managed and protected. Susan worked with financial advisors and legal professionals to handle her business affairs, a significant change from her previous life when she had minimal income and no need for such professional support. There were occasional reports in the media about financial disputes or concerns, but generally Susan's team appeared to manage her affairs responsibly. Health became another ongoing concern. The stress of her career and the emotional intensity of her experiences had taken a toll on Susan's mental and physical well-being. She experienced additional episodes of stress and anxiety over the years, requiring her to take breaks from performing and to prioritize her health over commercial opportunities. Susan was remarkably open about these struggles, discussing them in interviews and helping to reduce stigma around mental health issues. Her honesty about her challenges made her even more relatable to many fans who face their own mental health struggles. Susan also faced the normal health challenges that come with aging. As she moved through her 50s and into her 60s, she had to adapt her performance schedule and her vocal approach to accommodate changing physical capabilities. Professional singers often face difficulty maintaining their voices as they age, requiring careful management of their technique and their performance frequency. Susan worked with vocal coaches and medical professionals to protect her voice and ensure she could continue performing without causing damage. Today, more than 15 years after that extraordinary audition, Susan Boyle's legacy extends far beyond her album sales or concert performances. Her story has become part of popular culture, referenced in countless conversations about not judging people by appearances, about hidden talents, about the possibility of dreams coming true against long odds. The video of her initial audition remains one of the most watched and shared videos in internet history, continuing to move new viewers who encounter it years after it was originally filmed. Susan still lives in Blackburn, West Lothian, in the same modest home where she lived with her mother decades ago. She has made improvements and upgrades to the property over the years, but she never moved to a mansion or relocated to a glamorous location as many celebrities do. Her roots in that small Scottish village remain important to her, providing continuity and connection to the life she knew before fame transformed everything. The community has largely embraced her success while respecting her need for privacy and normalcy when she's home. The impact of Susan's story can be measured in many ways beyond commercial success or fame. She has inspired countless people to pursue their own dreams, regardless of age or circumstance. Music teachers report students who cite Susan as motivation to keep practicing and believing in their abilities. Community theater groups have seen increased participation from older performers who were inspired by Susan's example to finally try performing. Talent show producers worldwide have become more open to contestants who don't fit conventional molds, recognizing that extraordinary talent can come in unexpected packages. Susan's influence extends into charitable work and advocacy. She has supported numerous causes over the years, particularly those related to children, health, and disability rights. She has performed at charity events, donated money to organizations she believes in, and used her celebrity status to draw attention to important issues. This philanthropic work has provided meaning and purpose beyond her music career, allowing her to make a positive difference in ways that would have been impossible before her Britain's Got Talent audition changed her life. The entertainment industry learned important lessons from Susan's experience, though whether those lessons have been fully integrated remains debatable. There is greater awareness now of the responsibilities producers have toward contestants, particularly vulnerable individuals who may not be equipped to handle sudden fame and intense scrutiny. Mental health support is more commonly provided to reality show participants. However, the fundamental tensions between entertainment value and participant welfare continue, and new Susan Boyles continue to emerge. Face overwhelming for Susan personally, the journey has been complex and multifaceted. She achieved the dream she had carried for decades, becoming a professional singer known and appreciated around the world. She proved wrong everyone who had underestimated her, who had judged her based on appearance rather than ability, who had assumed she had nothing special to offer. She honored her mother's memory and validated the faith her mother had always had in her talent. These achievements brought genuine satisfaction and fulfillment, yet the journey also came with costs. Susan lost the anonymity and simple life she had known for 47 years. She experienced stress, anxiety, and mental health challenges that required professional treatment. She had to navigate a world of fame, business, and public scrutiny for which nothing in her previous life had prepared her. She faced continued judgment about her appearance and her personality, discovering that success didn't eliminate the cruel assessments of others. It just made them more public and widespread. Susan has spoken in interviews about the mixed nature of her experience, acknowledging both the wonderful opportunities and the difficult challenges. She has said that if she could go back, she would still audition for Britain's Got Talent, that the chance to share her voice and pursue her dreams was worth the hardships that came with it. But she has also been honest about how difficult parts of the journey were, how overwhelmed she sometimes felt, how much she has had to learn and adapt. In her 60s now, Susan continues to perform occasionally, though less frequently than in the years immediately following her discovery. She has found a balance that works for her, accepting some opportunities while declining others, protecting her health and well-being while still engaging with her music and her fans. She has matured into her role as a public figure, more comfortable now with interviews and appearances than she was in those overwhelming early days. Susan Boyle's story ultimately transcends any single category or simple narrative. It is simultaneously a story about talent recognized, dreams fulfilled, prejudice overcome, and the complicated nature of fame in the modern age. It demonstrates the power of authenticity and the universal human desire to see people valued for their genuine qualities rather than superficial characteristics. It shows both the opportunities and the dangers of sudden celebrity in the internet era. It reminds us that behind every ordinary appearing person might be extraordinary gifts waiting for the right moment to emerge. The crowd that laughed when Susan Boyle walked onto that stage in 2009 learned an important lesson that day, one that millions of people who watched the video learned as well. Never judge people by their appearance or their circumstances. Never assume you know someone's capabilities or their worth based on superficial assessments. Never underestimate the power of authentic talent and genuine passion to move and inspire people. Susan taught all of these lessons simply by having the courage to pursue her dream despite knowing she would face mockery and doubt. Her voice and her story continue to resonate, reminding us of human potential, the importance of second chances, and the possibility that dreams really can come true, even when they seem impossible. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.